In the hush before dawn, when the sea mists coil like restless spirits among the black fjords, an old man sits by a dying hearth. His beard is long, his eyes hollowed by years of secrets, and his voice carries the weight of 1,000 winters. He is a skald, a keeper of stories, but tonight his tongue turns to whispers few dare utter. A single rune stick rests on his lap, carved driftwood, smooth as bone, etched with lines that seem to shimmer in the flickering glow. He runs his finger along the grooves, eyes narrowing as though the past breathes from each cut. Outside, beyond the sod-roofed longhouse, the world is silent but for the distant creak of the pine forest and the hush of waves licking the shore. He begins to speak, not in the tongue of daily barter or drunken boasts, but in the old words, the binding words, the ones that once made even the fiercest axe-wielders pause before they stepped across another man's land. They say, a sharp blade can take a man's head, the old skald rasps, but a sharper word can take his luck, his breath, his bloodline. In the Viking age, the Norse feared many things, storms that could dash their longships upon jagged rocks, wolves that prowled the winter dark, spirits that lingered in burial mounds. But deeper than all these was a dread for curses, nid and seiðr hidden words, that turned the very fabric of fate against a man. It was not the clash of iron they feared most, but the unseen ruin that crept under doorways, settled on cattle, soured fields, and brought ruin to a warrior's line long after his sword was broken. When jarls and kings feasted in timbered halls, they told tales of berserkers and dragon-proud ships, yet somewhere, behind those boasts, flickered a quiet dread that all strength, all power, all fame could be undone by a whispered verse, a runic stave buried beneath the threshold, a curse flung like a spear by an unseen hand. In hidden corners of this hard land, there were those who knew the old arts. Women cloaked in sealskin, men who traced runes on sheep bones, voices that called to the hidden powers beneath root and stone. They spoke to the restless dead and asked for favours. They bound words to objects, to knives, to staffs, to poles planted in bitter soil facing a rival's home. And so an enemy's cattle failed to carve, a warrior's luck deserted him in battle, or a king's seed turned barren in his queen's womb. Even now, buried in bogs or wedged into ancient walls, rune sticks and blackened bones speak silently of this secret war, a war of words, of dread, of power hidden beneath the roar of Viking raids and sagas sung by firelight. The old skald lifts the rune stick to the hearth's dying glow. The runes catch the flame, shadows dancing in the carved lines. He mouths a fragment of a verse, half remembered, half forbidden. Somewhere in the dark beyond the door, a raven shifts on its perch and calls once an echo of all the tales the north still holds in its frost-bitten soil. A blade for the flesh, the skald murmurs, eyes half closed now, but a curse cleaves the soul. Outside, the first wind of dawn rattles the sod walls, and the hearth burns low. But the words linger ancient, hidden, waiting to be spoken once more. Before the cross came to the north, before Latin letters inked the parchment of laws and treaties, there were runes. Stark, jagged marks, not just letters, but living vessels, for something older than kings, older than skalds, older even than Odin's single remaining eye. The Vikings called them rune secrets. To carve a rune was not merely to write, but to cut a sliver into the hide of reality itself. Wood, stone, bone. These were the tablets on which fate could be shaped, twisted, turned back on itself, like a serpent swallowing its tail. They said the runes came from Odin's own agony. 9 nights the Allfather hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, wounded by his own spear, denied food and drink. There, swaying between life and death, he glimpsed the runes in the darkness below the roots, and wrested them from the void at the cost of his flesh and fear. Among the Norse, every carver of runes held a fragment of that god's stolen craft. A farmer might scratch a rune of protection into his door lintel to ward off sickness. A sailor would cut runes into the prow of his longship, hoping the waves would part like tame beasts. But those who knew how to bind runes into curses, these were the ones the neighbours watched with uneasy respect. A single rune could stand for a sound, a word, an idea. But it was the bind rune 2 or more runes spliced together that held real peril. The Isaz rune for ice, the Thurisaz for giants, the Northis for need and compulsion woven together. They became more than symbols. They became commands. An enemy's crops could be bound in winter's hunger. A warrior's shield could be made brittle as rotten wood. Archaeologists have found rune sticks in grave mounds, bogs, even in the ruins of farmsteads scorched by feuds. Many bear simple names or prayers. But sometimes the runes coil into more sinister shapes, curses against thieves who would break a grave's sanctity, or maledictions aimed at rivals whose luck needed blunting. One stick, unearthed from the black soil of Gotland, bears an inscription still whispered by scholars. May the worms eat your heart. May your luck run backward like a stream in frost. A single sliver of birch, but to the people who buried it beneath an enemy's threshold, it was a spear driven into his soul. Not every rune master was a witch. Some were simple folk who learned the shapes by hearthlight, copying them from stones or from an elder's memory. But among them rose the gifted men and women who claimed the title Runam the rune man or rune woman. Their hands were steady, their voices careful. They knew that to carve carelessly was to twist the spell back on the sender. In the sagas, there are stories of rune curses gone awry. A boastful farmhand who carved sickness into a rival's sheep, only to see his own herd wither first. A jarl's son who ordered a rune master to bind a lover's will and ended up mad himself, scratching runes into his own flesh until the blood told stories no skald dared repeat. The rune was blade and bond, threat and promise. Every stave carved into oak or horn was a needle stitching human will into the hidden fabric of the world, a fabric that, if tugged too sharply, could unravel more than the carver ever intended. Even today, on the weathered stones that stand forgotten in mossy fields, the runes remain. Some name the dead, others praise the gods. But there are runes whose meaning scholars still puzzle over bind runes that twist the eye and tongue, as though they guard a secret too dangerous to wake. And if you stand among them at dusk, when the sun dies behind the fjords and the cold breath of the past drifts in, listen, for the runes still speak in their own way. A promise and a warning. Words are weapons, and the sharpest blade is the one you cannot see. If the runes were blades hidden in plain sight, then the hands that wielded them belonged, more often than not, to the secret keepers of the Old North, the Seidr-workers and seiðr-men, the workers of seiðr. In the bright halls of the jarls, these men and women were rarely seen, but beyond the hearthlight, in the hollows of birch groves and wind-bent cliffs, they whispered to the land and to something older than any god carved in wood. No one in the village spoke their names too loudly. To do so was to catch their attention, and to draw a seiðr-worker's eye was to risk more than a feud. For these were the weavers of hidden threads, the binders of luck, the untanglers of the fate line that spun from a man's cradle to his cairn. The Norse sagas are blunt about war and glory, but they dance around seiðr like a hearth flame flickering at the edge of vision. Snorri Sturluson, writing centuries later, hints at their power, but cloaks it in half-truths. To the Christian chroniclers who came after, seiðr was witchcraft, the devil's breath, drifting through pagan lands. But to the Vikings themselves, seiðr was a perilous tool, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but always double-edged. In the oldest telling, seiðr was Odin's gift or his theft. The Allfather, in his endless hunger for knowledge, learned it from Freyja, the Vanir goddess, whose domain was beauty, fertility, and the deep wells of magic. Freyja is called the first seiðr-kona, mistress of charms and transformations. Through her the knowledge passed to a scattered few, cunning, women who could speak with the wind, read omens in spilled blood, and whisper sickness into a man's marrow. They did not dress as shield maidens did bright mail shirts and rings of iron. Instead, they wore cloaks of animal skins, beads of amber and bone. Some carried staffs carved with snake motifs, or crowned with iron shapes like a serpent swallowing its tail, a symbol of endings feeding beginnings. This staff, called a seiðr-staff, was more than a walking stick. It was a bridge between the seen and unseen. Picture a longhouse at the edge of a pine forest, winter-tight around its walls, snow drifting high against the timber. Inside, villagers huddle by the hearth, talking in hushed tones of a cow that calves stillborn, of a wife who wastes to skin and bone. Then the door creaks, and a figure enters, cloaked in wolf fur, carrying the staff that marks her as Völva Asíris. In the saga of Eric the Red, a Völva named Thorbjörg Lítilvölva travels from farm to farm in Greenland's icy frontier. She arrives when hope is lowest, when famine and sickness gnaw at people's faith. She asks for a high seat, a platform draped in skins. She asks for women to sing the old chants, varðlokkur, ward songs that lure spirits near. And then, with the beat of the drum and the drone of the chant, she lifts her staff and peers into the tangle of fate. Not all seiðr was seeing, though. Some was doing shaping. The same staff that called spirits could cast out luck like a snuffed flame. A cunning woman could bury a curse beneath your threshold, bind a hex into your bedstraw. The wrong word from her lips, the wrong token buried near your cattle's watering place, and your herd would founder, your grain rot green in the storehouse. There were seiðr men too, but they walked a knife's edge. In Norse culture, magic was a woman's realm, earthy, fluid, tied to blood and birth and the moon's hidden cycle. For a man to practice it was to court shame. The word was ergi unmanliness, perversion of the warrior's rightful nature. Yet Odin himself did it. The god of battle was also the god of secrets. His willingness to practice seiðr marked him as more than a warlord of the sky. It made him dangerous. Other, touched by the same shifting shadows as the volor who whispered beneath the eaves. So a man who practiced seiðr did so carefully, often hidden. Some were wanderers, exchanging secrets for coin or shelter, never staying long enough for suspicion to stick. Others served powerful households, employed in secret by jarls who needed more than swords to keep rivals at bay. In one saga, a king's favourite seiðr-worker is caught weaving weather spells to wreck an enemy's fleet he's found strangled. A rune stick splintered in his throat like a gag to bind his tongue forever. Among the common folk, the line between helper and threat blurred daily. The same woman who brewed healing teas for your fevered child might turn around and curse your milk cow if you crossed her. They said, never refuse a Völva food, never block her path. If she asked for silver, give it freely. If she spoke your name 3 times, answer humbly and pray her staff stayed pointed at the ground. Yet not every seiðr-worker was sinister. Some were honoured, kept in the circle of the community, called upon for blessings, safe childbirth, harvest rites. They were midwives of more than bodies. They midwifed the passage from misfortune to hope, steering the unseen currents that ran beneath the hard soil and harder hearts of the north. Archaeologists still find echoes of them. Iron staffs buried beside women in mounds, their bodies laid out with beads, herbs, and small bones of birds. One such grave, on the island of Oseberg, revealed a woman surrounded by treasures, tapestries, sledges, sacrificial animals. Some scholars say she was a queen. Others say she was something rarer, still a Velva so powerful that chieftains paid homage to her as they would to a king. The Christian priests who came after branded these cunning women witches servants of the devil who should be drowned or burned. But the North remembered differently. Even centuries later, in the far fjords where churches rose among ancient stones, people still left bowls of milk by the doorway for the spirits, still feared the black look of an old woman's eye. In winter, when storms clawed at the roof and the cattle moaned restlessly, the wise knew better than to speak too loudly of the seiðr-workers, those who wove words sharper than any sword. To curse was to shape the unseen. To wield seiðr was to stand in the crossroads of fear and need. And so the seiðr and seiðmen endured shadows in the corner of Viking life, half revered, half reviled, but always waiting, staff in hand, at the edge of the firelight where old magic never truly dies. When we speak of the Viking warrior, the ironclad raider, howling beneath a black sail, axe swinging like a storm wind, we imagine flesh and steel deciding the fate of kingdoms. But beyond the edge of the blade lay another battlefield, invisible yet more treacherous. For the Norse believed that a man's luck hemingja was as vital as his sword arm, and luck could be poisoned. The sagas are littered with half-whispered tales of warriors undone before they ever stepped onto the shield wall. A single rune carved beneath a ship's mast. A muttered spell as men slept in their war tents. A curse woven by a seiðr and carried on the wind like a raven's cry. To understand Viking curses on the battlefield, we must first understand the heart of Norse warfare, the shield wall. Rows of men shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping like scales, a wall of wood and iron that turned a mob into a living beast. But that wall depended on trust that the man beside you would hold fast, that his luck and yours were woven together. If his luck failed, yours might unravel with it. So when two rival clans feuded over land, over silver, over slights that lingered like old wounds, the clash of swords was only half the fight. The real war began in secret, nights before blood ever stained the grass. Picture a chieftain's hall, thick with smoke and the smell of roast meat. Beneath the drinking horns and the boasts sits a man like any other, but his eyes flick often to the door, and his hand tightens around the amulet at his throat. For he knows that somewhere beyond the walls, a rival's seiðr-worker scratches runes into driftwood, spitting curses into the snow. A saga from the Orkneys tells of Einar, a petty king who trusted his rune worker to carve protection runes on his war banner, a great black raven said to fly when victory was near. But his rival's cunning woman turned the magic backward. On the morning of battle, the raven drooped lifeless on its pole, and Einar's men broke before the first spear struck home. Some said the curse tangled their minds, made them see ghosts on the field, made their blades feel heavy as lead. Runic curses were the simplest weapons. A single stave scratched onto a blade could blunt its edge, or so warriors believed. A rune hidden beneath the grip could twist the blade in its wielder's hand. Archaeologists have found swords with curious markings, bind runes, whose full meaning is lost, but whose placement hints at more than mere decoration. Yet words alone were not always enough. To strengthen a battlefield curse, some seiðr-workers demanded blood, an animal's sacrifice, or something dearer still. On the eve of battle, cattle might be slaughtered, their entrails red for signs. If an enemy's luck seemed too strong, the seiðr-worker might bury a heart beneath the enemy's mustering ground, the red muscle rotting into the soil, carrying whispered runes to the boots of men who would tread on it unaware. The greatest warriors knew this hidden war well. Berserkers, those wolf-skinned, bare-hearted terrors who bit their shields and howled as if possessed, were said to be near impervious to common blades but vulnerable to curses. Some chieftains paid cunning women to break the berserkers' fury with runes etched onto boars' tusks, then hidden where they would sleep or drink. There is a tale in the Ynglinga saga of a king who turned his berserkers against an enemy clan, only to see them stand frozen in battle, their madness drained by an unseen spell. The fear was not just of death, but of dishonour. A curse could strip a warrior of his courage. In the Norse mind, courage was not just a feeling, it was a tangible part of one's luck, one's fylgja or spirit follower. If a curse severed this link, even the bravest man might break and flee. Better to die on the shield wall than live with the shame of a back turned in flight. This fear gave rise to counter-magic. Warriors carried amulets, Thor's hammers of carved bone, rings of iron inscribed with protective runes. Before a raid, some men would stand before a velver, to be blessed not just for victory, but for protection from hidden ruin. Fires were lit in camp, not merely for warmth, but to ward off wandering spirits. A trusted man might bury a blade under the path leading to the enemy camp, a gift to bind the feet of his foes with ill luck. Yet, even with these protections, the fear lingered. The Icelandic saga of Egil Skallagrimsson tells of a warrior who, before battle, found a stick near his bed. On it were carved runes. He fell sick immediately, unable to stand. His comrades burned the stick, called a seiðr-worker to counter the spell, and buried the ashes far from camp. Only then did his strength return, though his comrades swore he fought like a man whose luck was frayed at the edges. To be cursed in battle was not always the work of humans alone. Some believed the land itself could be turned against an army. Marshes that swallowed men whole, sudden storms that smashed ships against hidden reefs, all could be blamed on curses whispered by seiðr-workers. A chieftain whose ships vanished into the fog might be mocked by rivals. Your luck sailed before you, but the seiðr-workers found it first. Perhaps the most feared curse of all was the nithing, the insult pole. Erected near an enemy's land, this stake, crowned with a horse's head or carved phallus, proclaimed a curse so foul that it poisoned not just a man, but his descendants. A nithing was a public wound to honour its runes, dared the victim to answer blade for blade, curse for curse, or be branded nithinger a coward, worse than an outlaw. To leave it standing was to accept ruin. In the hush of the battlefield dawn, when frost still silvered the grass and breath steamed from waiting warriors, these unseen weapons weighed as heavily as iron swords. A man might test his blade's edge on a stone, then turn it skyward and whisper a prayer not only to Odin or Thor, but to whatever hidden power might turn a curse aside. If the wind shifted, if a raven called twice, men would trade uneasy glances, wondering if the curse had already struck, if luck had already fled. For in the end, a Viking's greatest strength was not his sword, but the force that lay behind it, the web of luck, fate, and secret words that could bend or break the will of even the fiercest raider. And so on the battlefield, amid the roar of axes and the crash of shields, another war raged, silent, invisible, fought in runes, bones, whispers, and the bitter dread that in the north a word could kill as surely as steel. Not all curses in the Viking world were carved into bone or hidden beneath thresholds. Some rode the air itself spoken maledictions, words loosed like arrows into the fabric of a man's luck. In the north, where the voice could summon storms and bind oaths, a spoken curse was feared as much as a blade at the throat. The Norse called it felkingi, cunning speech. To curse with the tongue was to shape breath into a weapon. The seiðr-workers and volor were masters of it, but they were not alone. Any person with a sharp wit and a sharper spite could wield words that stung deeper than steel. A feud might begin with a slight, fester with a whispered rumour, and erupt in curses spat across a smoky hall. Imagine a chieftain's feast, benches crowded with warriors, a skald chanting of ancient deeds. Yet somewhere in the shadows sits a man nursing bitter ale and bitterer thoughts. His brother slain by the man at the high seat, his land stripped, his kin scattered. He has no blade, no shield wall to stand behind. But his tongue remains, and in a lull of laughter, he leans forward, spits a single line of poison. May your sons drink salt water in place of milk, and your line fall to frost. The words drift out over the fire, half lost in the crackle of the hearth, yet every man hears them. A hush falls the crack of bones thrown to the hounds, the scrape of knives against trenchers. In the north, such words were not empty. They were binding. They clung to a man's name like burrs to a cloak. To curse aloud was to risk your own life. The wrong words could invite a blade to your belly or the law's cold judgment. But if you spoke carefully, wrapped your malice in riddle and rhyme, you could slip past a chieftain's wrath and strike where swords could not reach. The sagas are salted with such tales. In Grettir's saga, the outlaw Grettir is cursed by a witch woman who mutters over a burning brand. Cold shall follow him like a hungry wolf, and luck flee his hand. Grettir, once fierce as a bear, finds himself hunted, plagued by misfortune, until he dies alone, his bones bleaching on a storm-bitten skerry. Spoken curses drew power from more than just anger. They fed on secrets, a man's hidden shame, a woman's barren womb, a feud buried under forced smiles. A skald might slip a curse into a verse, veiled in praise so finely that the victim would only taste the poison when it was too late. Some words were spat in rage, but the most feared were woven slowly, fed with ritual. The Velva might stand at the edge of a grave mound, her staff pointed to the horizon. She would speak the name of the victim 3 times, each time softer than the last, until the name seemed to vanish into the cold earth. Then she would whisper the curse, sending it down to the restless dead, a pact that tied the living to the hunger of those who lay beneath the turf. To the Norse, a name was never just a label. It carried the weight of family, deeds, and fate. To speak a name in a curse was to pull on the thread that bound a man to his kin and the world. The stronger the name a king's, a warrior's the deeper the wound, if that name was poisoned by words. The most skilled in spoken malediction were known to keep their tongues sharp with oaths and riddles. They learned how to twist, meaning to bury curses in riddling verses that might pass a lord's ear, but still sink barbs into a rival's luck. They were wolves among sheep, their teeth hidden behind smiles and songs. Some spells had to be spoken at precise moments. The turning of the tide, the crack of dawn when night's shadows fled, or the deep hush before the first snow fell. A seiðr-worker might wait for a waxing moon to lift her curse into the night sky, carried on wind and frost. Others spoke curses into knots of wool or strands of hair. The words sealed tight until the knot was loosed. If buried under a doorstep, the curse would bleed into the threshold, tripping all who crossed it into ruin. Among seafarers, the spoken curse was a perilous weapon. A jealous shipmate might whisper ruin into the wind, calling storms onto the sailcloth. A tale from the Faroe Islands tells of a captain whose lover, scorned and left pregnant, spat her curse as he boarded his ship. "Your mast shall snap before you see these islands again." They found his wreck 3 weeks later, smashed on hidden rocks, the mast broken like a matchstick. The spoken curse thrived because it could be denied. A rune stick is evidence, a nithing is proof. But a word, once spoken, vanishes into air, leaving only its echo to coil around the unlucky soul who drew its ire. How could a chieftain punish that which left no trace? How could a family prove that their withered fields were not the work of frost alone, but frost guided by a rival's tongue? In the Icelandic Gragas, the ancient law codes warn of slander and harmful speech, but draw no clear line between insult and sorcery. To call a man ergi unmanly could cost you silver or your life. To wish ill fortune on his kin might earn you a blood feud lasting generations. The church that crept into the north tried to bind the wolf's tongue in chains of penance and confession, but old habits die harder than iron rusts. In the far valleys and scattered farms, men and women still spat curses into the wind, muttered them into the folds of an enemy's cloak, or dropped them like stones into dark wells where secrets sank out of sight. In the end, the spoken curse was both weapon and warning. It reminded the Vikings that words have weight, that breath can bind, that the unseen world listens when the tongue moves. To be careless with words was to invite ruin, for in the north a man's honour was bound to his name, and a name twisted by a curse might drag him into darkness deeper than any blade could carve. So they spoke carefully, these fierce people of frost and fjord. They praised loudly, insulted cunningly, and cursed only when the need was dire for once loosed. The wolf's tongue could never be caged again. Beneath the roar of axes and the clash of longships, the Vikings waged another, quieter war, a war of shame. Honour was the iron spine of Norse life. A man without it was a corpse that still breathed. And among all the weapons that could ruin a man's honour, none cut deeper than the nithing pole. Where sword and shield struck the body, the nithing pole struck the soul. It was the Norse world's cruelest curse, not hidden in whispers or buried beneath thresholds, but planted boldly for all to see, a declaration that a man had been unmade in the eyes of his people. To stand in the shadow of a nithing was to feel your name rot like meat left too long in summer sun. For the Vikings, this was a fate worse than death. An outlaw could still fight, still claim some shred of courage, but a nithingr, a dishonoured man, was filth. A man marked by the pole found doors slammed shut, hearths turned cold, kin averting their eyes, as if he were already dead. The pole itself was simple, a stake of wood driven deep into earth on the edge of a rival's land. But atop it, that was where its venom coiled. A horse's head, hacked from the living beast, its jaws stretched wide as if in a perpetual scream. Some carvers crowned it with obscene runes, or carved grotesque phallic shapes to mock the man's manhood, for the worst insult in the Viking mind was to strip a man of his masculinity. To raise a nithing was not done in secret. No hidden rites in the midnight forest, no whispered runes buried like poison seeds. Instead, it was spectacle. It demanded witness. Men would stand in the raw wind at dawn, drive the stake into frozen earth, while chanting curses that clawed at the victim's name. Some spat on the horse's severed head, some smeared it with blood. All this to bind the curse so tightly to the man that not even Thor's hammer could break it. One saga tells of a chieftain named Hrap, who, cheated of land by a wealthier neighbour, raised a nithing pole on the disputed field. He spoke the victim's name aloud 3 times, to echo through the realms of men and spirits alike, then drove the stake so deep it cracked the stones below. That winter, the neighbour's herds sickened, his son drowned beneath ice, and his house burned to black cinders. Whether these ills came by chance or by cunning hand mattered little. The village spoke of Hrap's curse in hushed tones for generations. The nithing was more than a curse. It was a declaration of social war. To be so shamed was to be exiled without being driven out. Your neighbours turned from you as if you were already carrion for wolves. Your children carried the stain. Your grandchildren might struggle under its weight. In a culture that measured worth by honour and kinship, this was ruin beyond the grave. Even kings feared the pole. In the old skaldic verses, Harold Bluetooth was mocked as Nithinger by rebels who claimed he'd betrayed his people to Christian priests. They planted nithing poles along roads to his hall horseheads, rotting in the wind, warning that his kingship could be undone not by armies, but by words and shame. Sometimes the pole struck not just a man, but the land itself. A farmer's field might wither, his cattle drop calves stillborn, if a rival drove a pole into the boundary. The earth drank the pole's venom, and the people whispered that the soil itself turned against its master. Scholars argue whether the nithing was pure threat, or whether people truly believed it called real misfortune. But to the Vikings, the difference was thin as a strand of hair. A man's luck was not merely his alone, it seeped into his land, his animals, his kin. Curse the land, and you weakened the man. Curse the man, and you soured the land. One bled into the other, roots tangled deep beneath snow and stone. What made the nithing pole so feared was its raw audacity. A rune stick hidden under a bed could be found and burned. A spoken curse might be denied. But a horse head rotting in the yard that was proof as bold as any blow from an axe. To ignore it was to confess your cowardice. To cut it down was to accept its challenge. Some victims struck back with violence. The only cure for shame was blood spilled to wash it clean. But striking back could feed the curse. Blood on snow, fresh grave mounds, the stink of a horse's skull, black with rot. These were potent offerings to the hidden powers. A feud might spread like fire through dry grass. Kin rose to avenge kin. Villages split down family lines. One pole could start a chain of ruin that flickered through generations. In a world where the law bound men by oaths, and the thing judged crimes by word and witness, the nithing lived outside the law. No court could unmake its curse. No fine could pay it off. The only cure was revenge, so brutal it silenced the whispering tongues. Archaeologists have found hints of this dark custom in old turf walls and field edges, wooden stakes buried beneath later farmsteads, animal bones charred by fire, runes carved in crude shapes no Christian would bless. In Iceland's sagas, they surface again and again, like bones in thawing soil, grim reminders that the fiercest warriors knew fear, and that fear often came on 4 hooves and a sharpened stake. When Christianity spread through the north, priests called the nithing a relic of pagan devilry. They preached that shame was a sin to confess, not a curse to cast. Yet in the far fjords and icy uplands, the poles still rose. A horse's head atop a weathered stake, a threat older than any church bell, its grin splitting wide in the wind. Even today, old farmers in Norway and Iceland sometimes speak of boundary markers that should never be disturbed, stones or posts that stand in fields older than any written deed. Some say to move them is to stir up ruin, to wake the sleeping shame bound beneath. So the nithing pole endures in the half-light of memory. A curse not hidden, but shouted to the world, a horse's head screaming its silent oath, that in the north, worse than the sword's bite was to stand shunned by hearth and kin, a name turned sour by a stake of wood and the rot of old blood. If the nithing pole was a curse hurled openly, then the darkest Viking maledictions were whispered in graveyards and barrow mounds, places where the dead did not rest easily, and neither did those who sought their hidden power. For in the Norse world, the bones of the dead were more than relics. They were vessels of lingering might, veins of power that could be plundered and twisted by cunning hands. Picture a frost-hardened night on the edge of a settlement. Beyond the ring of warm hearths, a figure moves by moonlight across the burial field. She is draped in a wolfskin cloak, her breath steaming as she kneels beside an ancient barrow, a mound that has slept undisturbed for a century or more. Her tools are simple: a knife of antler, a clay bowl, a handful of salt and ash. Her heart beats like a drum, for she knows what she does is both sacred and monstrous. The Norse believed that the dead carried power, heroes buried with swords, still clutched in bony hands, chieftains laid beneath stone ships, surrounded by grave goods meant to serve them in the afterlife. These tombs were not only honoured, but feared. To disturb them was to risk the wrath of the Draugr, the restless dead spirits who could rise and crush the living, who trespassed too boldly. Yet for the seiðr-workers, the risk was worth it. Bone dust taken from the grave of a mighty warrior or a cunning witch could fuel the most potent curses. In the saga of Hrolfr Kraki, a cunning woman grinds the rib of a dead king to powder, mixing it with blood and binding it to a rune stave. The man she curses is said to waste away within a moon's turning, his strength leached by the grave's cold hunger. These rituals were not done lightly. The seiðr-workers came armed with chants and iron knives, iron, cold-forged, to cut through the power of the dead. First, they would draw a circle around the grave, scattering salt and ash to bind the spirit within its mound. Then, with quiet words, they would ask permission or defy it, outright slicing open the turf, peeling back the earth like old skin. A shard of bone was enough, a knuckle, a tooth, a scrap of rib. Wrapped in linen, sealed with runes for secrecy, it would be carried back to the longhouse where the true work began. There, by the dying glow of a hearth, the bone would be ground to dust on a stone quern. Mixed with herbs henbane, wolfsbane, or the bitter gall of birch bark, the dust became a poison for luck, a sickness of the soul. This was the hidden poison of Viking feuds. A warrior might stand proud in his ringmail, his axe bright with edge, never knowing that under his threshold lay a tiny pouch of grave dust. Every step he took across that threshold was a step deeper into ruin. His sword might stay sharp, but his dreams would turn sour, his harvest fail, his children fall sick, for no cause that healers could name. One fragment of an old saga tells of a farmer whose wife fell barren. He found beneath his bed a small bundle, grave dust bound in lambskin, carved with runes that spelled not words but bindings, to knot the womb, to dry the seed. He tracked the curse to his neighbour's kin, and blood ran in the snow before the feud was done. But the curse lingered long after the killing, a whisper of ruin that clung to the soil for years. Such rituals were not confined to human remains alone. In the far north, the bones of animals held power too. The Sami shamans, whom the Vikings both traded with and feared, were said to grind bear claws or reindeer antler to powder, sprinkling it across hunting paths to bind a rival's luck or drive prey away. This practice seeped into Norse cunning, mingling with older traditions like roots winding through old earth. In some tales, The grave dust was mixed with ale or mead. To drink it was to drink a ghost to invite the dead into your belly, where it would gnaw your strength from within. Hostile housewives, so the stories go, sometimes slipped bone dust into their husbands' cups if a rival woman turned his eye. The man would waste away, thin as a birch branch in winter, while the seiðr-workers' silver clinked in secret purses. Christian priests, when they came to the north, called these rites devil's work. They urged converts to bury their dead deep, to seal graves with stones and holy signs. Yet, even in the new faith's light, the old fear lingered. Some churchyards in Iceland still keep stories of buried bones that will not stay still, of graves that, if disturbed, call sickness onto entire farms. Not every grave ritual was meant to harm. Some cunning folk sought the bones for knowledge. A vulva might sit on a grave mound all night, staff across her knees, calling up the spirit within to ask about hidden truths, the whereabouts of lost cattle, the fate of a coming raid. But once you spoke to the dead, you were never quite free of them. Many a seiðr-worker's staff has been found buried with her, her body laid in the mound with herbs and iron knives, as if to bind her restless tongue, even in death. Archaeologists today still find these grave traces, tiny bone fragments, scorched by fire, stone querns stained with odd residues, burial mounds opened centuries ago and crudely sealed again, the grave goods scattered, the bones disturbed and reburied by trembling hands who knew they had stolen something more than earth and ash. Standing in these fields now, with wind sighing through heather and the hum of distant rivers, it is hard to feel that hidden dread. But dig deep enough, and the story rises like grave smoke, that in the Viking age, the dead were never wholly dead. Their bones were keys, their dust was poison, and in the wrong hands, a handful of grave soil could ruin a king more surely than 100 blades. To sail with axe and shield across foreign seas, this was the glory that filled the sagas, the dreams of chieftains and skalds. Yet for every warrior who carved his name in distant stone, 100 farmers stayed behind to coax life from the harsh northern soil. And in their world, the fiercest enemies did not always wield swords. They wielded whispered words, hidden charms, small curses buried in the folds of daily life. The Norse farmer lived in a realm balanced on a knife's edge. His sheep and cattle were wealth incarnate. His grain stores were life or famine. A single bad carving, a sudden blight in the barley, a cow that sickened for no reason, these were blows as grave as a spear to the gut. But when ruin crept in unseen, suspicion bloomed in the shadows. Someone, somewhere, had twisted fate against him. To understand the farmer's fear is to stand in the silence of an early dawn. Frost crusts the field. The thatch roof smokes where warmth leaks from the hearth. A man steps out, breath rising like ghostly steam. He squints at the sheep pen and freezes. One ewe lies stiff by the fence, her eyes glassy, her belly bloated. In the north, death is never just death. The man kneels, fingers cold on the wool, looking for signs. Hoof marks? A wolf? Or something else? A scrap of cloth tied to the fence post? A bundle of herbs wedged under the gate? A sign that human malice has crept through the night. This was the unspoken dread that threaded through village life. Feuds flared not only in spear thrusts, but in the quiet sabotage of a man's luck. A rival who envied your fertile cows might seek out the old woman at the edge of the wood, the one who knew which root to grind, which chant to murmur over a scrap of hide. A handful of cursed butter slipped into the churn, and suddenly milk soured overnight. Butter refused to form, the cream turned thin and bitter. Such petty malice bled into every corner of daily labour. Fishermen feared hidden runes carved on their boats, binding storms to their sails. Shepherds watched the hills for strange tokens, bird bones, bound with string, left where flocks grazed. If lambs were stillborn or vanished into the forest, suspicion turned quickly to curses. A dead lamb at birth might be the work of frost, or a seiðr-worker's touch, coiling like mist into the warm folds of the ewe. In the Eyrbyggja saga, a farmer named Thorolf Twistfoot feuds with his neighbours over grazing rights. His cattle sicken and die, and he swears a neighbour has cursed his pasture with a fylgja, a spirit that haunts the herd. When Thorolf dies, his restless spirit is so feared that his kin abandon the farm altogether, letting the pastures grow wild, rather than risk the hidden malice left clinging to the soil. Women were often blamed for such domestic curses. In a world where they managed food, milk, and the turning seasons of the home, they stood at the unseen crossroads of life and ruin. The same hands that churned butter or spun wool might slip a needle into the floorboards, a needle charmed to twist a rival wife's luck or bind her womb tight as winter ground. These were not crimes that the law courts could easily judge. A spear wound could be weighed and repaid in silver. But who could measure the worth of a cow's calf or the warmth of a newborn child that never drew breath? Who could prove a handful of dirt left in a grain bin had been charmed to rot the harvest? Accusation, rumour, and fear were the coins that bought justice when no iron blade could. Some farmers sought protection through simple magic of their own. They hung runes over doorways, alges for protection, yerra for a fruitful harvest. Iron knives were buried in thresholds to cut the feet of bad spirits. Herbs like mugwort and angelica were hung in rafters, their smell a sharp promise that sickness would not slip down the chimney unbidden. More secret still were the trolldoma charms, small, hidden tokens carried on the body. A pouch of rowan berries, a twist of wolf hair, a sliver of steel hammered on the anvil at midnight. Such talismans turned the hidden eye back on its sender, a farmer's small defiance against the weight of envy and spite. Yet protection could feed suspicion too. A man whose herds never sickened, whose barley always ripened heavy and golden, drew uneasy stares at the thing. How did he prosper while others failed? Whose hand guided his luck? It was whispered that he might have bartered with a seiðr-worker for more than a blessing that perhaps he paid in secrets, or let her bind another man's luck in knots of bone and ash. A single small object could turn neighbours to foes. In the settlement of Garcia, archaeologists unearthed a tiny iron amulet, shaped like a fishhook, buried at the threshold of a barn. Its purpose is debated still. Was it a charm to ensure nets overflowed with fish, or a hidden curse to snare a rival's fortune and drag it from his hearth to another's? The church, when it came, railed against these low daily magics as the devil's work. Priests scoured farms for hidden runes, burned herbs that smelt of old pagan rites. Yet they could not strip the fear from the soil. A farmer might cross himself at the church door on Sunday and bury a charm in his grain bin by moonlight the same night, a hedge against the spite of jealous neighbours, the creeping ruin that did not come with spears, but with silence. In the far fjords and uplands, echoes of this fear lingered long after the last Viking raider traded his axe for the plough. Into the 19th century, old farmers still placed iron shears under a cow's belly during calving, to cut the power of a lurking curse. In the deep forests of Sweden, milkmaids whispered charms to keep butter from turning sour. And even today, some old farms hold stories of a calf born lame or a rowan sprig nailed to a barn door, signs that envy and spite never truly left the farmstead, only learned to hide in the folds of modern life. So when we picture the Vikings, let us not see only the howling warriors and blood-slick shields. Let us remember the farmer, knee-deep in snow before dawn, staring at a dead ewe and wondering whose whisper killed her. For in the north, a curse did not always roar like thunder. Sometimes it crept, soft as frost under a closed door, a hidden word that turned the hard work of honest hands to dust. Among the Norse, oaths were iron. To break one was to break the web of trust that held families, clans, and kingdoms together. Yet in a world where swords flashed and curses crept in shadows, some oaths were so fierce they carried their own curse, a promise bound by fear of the unseen, by dread of spirits and gods who watched with cold eyes. And none was heavier than the oath sworn by the shield-biters, the berserkers. Picture a cold dawn on the edge of a pine forest. Mist curls through the trees, curling around a circle of men stripped to the waist despite the chill. Their shoulders are scarred, painted with ash and animal fat. At their centre stands the oldest among them, his hair bound in a wolf's pelt, his eyes hollowed by visions that dance just beyond mortal sight. In his hand he holds an iron spear, its point dipped in the blood of a freshly slain ram. These are no common warriors. They are berserker men who swear to fight with the fury of beasts, to feel no pain, to break shield walls like waves crashing on rock. But that rage did not rise from meat and muscle alone. It was shaped by ritual, sealed by oath, and bound by the threat of curses far darker than any spear thrust. The tales call them Ulfheðnar, two wolfcoats, berserkers who donned wolf or bear skins to summon the animal within. But beneath the pelts lay the words secret words that yoked man and beast together, and yoked both to an oath that could snap a man's mind if broken. In the sagas, the berserker's oath is hinted at in half-lines and riddles. They swore to Odin first, the god who gave battle fury and madness alike. They pledged to stand unyielding, to never flee, to never let blade slip from hand, to fight even when the shield cracked and the bones beneath it splintered like old wood. To break this vow was to invite ruin not from mortal blades, but from within. Berserkers trained their minds, as well as their bodies, for this dread. Some drank bitter brews, a stew of henbane or fly agaric mushrooms to unmoor the senses. Others carved runes of frenzy into their weapons, their belts, even their skin, but these were only the kindling. The true fire was the oath. One fragment, preserved in the Vatsdala saga, tells of a young berserker named Bjarki. On his first night among the shield-biters, he was brought to the forest's edge, where a great standing stone rose from the moss like the back of an ancient whale. There the leader smeared the stone with blood and pressed Bjarki's forehead to its cold flank. He whispered an oath, to die with axe in hand, to taste the sweetness of his own blood before surrender, to trust no blade that had not tasted an enemy's flesh. Breaking such an oath carried a double doom. First came the shame, no small thing for men who built their names on fear. A berserker who fled the fight, who let terror cool his blood, was nithinger, unmanly, unworthy, fit only to be cast from the hall like rotten meat. But deeper than shame was the spiritual retribution that stalked an oathbreaker. In Norse belief, an unkept vow unravels a man's luck, his hamingja. The line of fate that binds him to his ancestors snaps like an old bowstring. His dreams sour, his food tastes of ash, his weapons betray him in his hand. Some sagas whisper that oath-breaking berserkers were hunted by spirits, the ghosts of those they'd sworn to protect, or the animals whose skins they wore in battle. One story tells of a berserker who abandoned the shield wall in a raid near Dublin, When he fled into the woods, his brothers found him days later, eyes clawed out as if by an unseen bear. They buried him face down, iron shears on his chest to bind his restless spirit to the grave. To guard against such ruin, berserkers bound their oaths with visible signs. Before battle, they would bite the rims of their shields, a ritual that gave them their name, berserker gangra, the going berserk. Shield biting was no mere show. It was an act of submission to the fury that owned them, and a warning to the hidden world that their oath was sealed in teeth and blood. Witnesses spoke of them, standing in lines, jaws working at the iron rims, froth gathering at the corners of their mouths as they muttered half-heard words, prayers to Odin, promises to Fenrir the wolf, threats to any spirit or rival who might twist their strength. Some spat blood onto their blades, marking them as kin to the beast within. Yet the same force that made them terrifying made them fragile. A berserker who lost faith in his oath, who doubted, even for a heartbeat, might break the spell himself. The flighting poems of the skalds sometimes mocked this weakness. They would cast sly verses, riddling taunts meant to slip past the shield wall and bury seeds of doubt in a berserker's mind. It was said that only another oath could break the shield biter's vow, a stronger promise, sworn under threat of greater ruin. Some chieftains, wary of losing control over such men, bound them with double oaths. Loyalty not just to the gods, but to the chieftain's own luck, the wellspring of his clan's fortune. To betray this bond was to become a walking curse, hunted by kin and spirits alike. Archaeologists have unearthed odd hints of this hidden war, stones carved with bite marks, as if teeth had scored runes into them. Axe handles inscribed with bind runes that twist the words for wolf and oath together, like two serpents devouring each other's tails. Christian scribes, when they wrote of berserkers, saw only madness. But in the Old North, that madness was shaped by words sharper than iron. It was not enough to wear a bear skin, you had to swear to become the bear, or the wolf, or whatever spirit carried your rage beyond the reach of fear. And so the shield biter's oath bound men as tightly as iron fetters. It made them monsters to their enemies, and sometimes to themselves. It stitched their courage to a blade edge, and left them one heartbeat from ruin should they falter. When next you hear the word berserk, remember this. Beneath the roar and the blood was a vow, and behind that vow, the hidden terror that in the north, an oath broken, was never truly buried. It rose in dreams, it howled in the dark, and it waited patient as the wolf to tear the luck from any man who dared betray it. In the Viking world, power flowed through many channels, a sharp sword, a well-built ship, the voice of a skald spinning sagas into eternity. But among these open tools of honour and fame lay a darker current, seiðr, the secret art that could twist the threads of fate itself. To wield seiðr was to trespass beyond the pale of what was manly, proper, and safe. It was to cross a line that even the bravest shield biter might fear. Seiðr promised much. Wealth conjured where there was none. Storms calmed or summoned on command. Enemies struck blind or barren without a blade lifted in anger. Yet the same power that made seiðr so tempting made it dangerous not only for the victim, but for the one who dared weave its secrets. To the Norse mind, all things had a rightful shape. The earth yielded to the plough, the sea yielded to the oar, and a man's life should yield to steel and chance, not hidden poison. But seiðr bent what should stand straight. It twisted nature's bones, gave shape to shadows, and muddied the clear water of the world with half-seen things. A warrior's honour lay in the open blow, the axe stroke that cleaved the helm, the oath kept beneath a hail of spears. but seiðr moved in secret. It struck a man as he slept, whispered poison into his luck, soured his ale, and made him weak from within. And so, to wield it was to risk dishonour. Among men, that dishonour was summed up in one word: ergi unmanliness, effeminacy, a taint that could stain even a mighty chieftain if he stooped to hidden arts. Yet the paradox sits sharp as an iron hook. The gods themselves used seiðr. Odin, father of battles, father of kings, was called the master of seiðr. He hung from the world tree for 9 nights, wounded and alone, to drink secrets from the hidden well. He whispered to ravens and wolves, traded an eye for wisdom, wore the shifting skin of the shaman who crossed all boundaries. And Freya, the Vanir goddess, taught him this forbidden craft. She herself was the first seiðr-worker, mistress of charms, weaver of desires and storms. Among the people who worshipped her, seiðr was woman's work, earthy, intimate, tangled with the hidden cycles of blood and birth. For a woman to wield, it was both fearsome and fitting. For a man, it balanced forever on the edge of taboo. This danger gave seiðr a moral shape, unlike any other Viking craft. A blacksmith forged iron to cleave flesh, but his hammer sang in the open. A scold's words praised or mocked in halls full of witness. But the seiðr-workers' words whispered in forests at night, at thresholds where no man watched. They called up spirits, spoke to the dead, bartered with hidden powers that might give a man victory in the thing, and then demand his luck in payment when the snow fell deep. Stories linger in the sagas of men ruined by crossing this line. One tells of a chieftain's son, Hallbjorn, who sought the help of a cunning woman to bind a rival's tongue. She carved runes onto a fishbone and whispered her curse under a waning moon. Hallbjorn's rival fell mute, but so did Hallbjorn's own sister, her words lost for a year and a day, her wits wandering like mist on the fjord. In shame, Hallbjorn fled, a man no longer welcome in any hall, for his hidden magic had soured his kin. Yet for every ruin, there were tales of those who thrived by daring what others feared. Some jarls kept seiðr, workers close, not in the bright hall where warriors feasted, but in dark corners, working hidden arts to turn a feud's tide. A rival ship might run aground on reefs unseen. A son's inheritance might slip away in sickness and failed harvests. And all the while, the chieftain's luck fattened, fed by invisible hands that demanded their price only in shadows. To cross the seiðr line was not only a matter of courage, but of cunning. Those who worked the craft knew to wrap themselves in layers of ritual and secrecy. A seiðr-worker did not blurt her price. At the hearth fire she spoke in riddles, gave half promises. She hedged her words with if and unless. For in the north, a word spoken carelessly could twist back upon its sender like a knife turned in the dark. The Thing, the great assembly of free men, made few clear laws against seiðr, for how could they bind what hid in whispers and wind? But any man who was proved to wield it for harm risked outlawry, exile, or worse. And so the craft lived in the crevices, between families feuding over pasture, between lovers spurned and hungry for revenge, between farmers who stared at a neighbour's richer fields with envy that festered like rot. Among common folk, fear and need balanced the moral scales. A farmer might mutter curses under his breath if his fields failed, but to hire a seiðr-worker to blight another man's herd was a darker deed altogether. Some did it all the same, choosing secret ruin over open feud, the coward's blow over the warrior's clash. But the Norse knew there was no escaping the price. A curse cast returned threefold, if the spirits were slighted or the ritual poorly done. Christian priests, when they came with silver crosses and Latin prayers, saw seiðr for what it was, a rival power. They branded it sin, the devil's touch, but they also knew that fear is stubborn. They thundered from pulpits against cunning women, but still people crept to forest huts on frost-hushed nights, clutching coins and whispers. The priests learned to weave the old fear into their new faith, promising forgiveness for sinners, but damnation for those who sought the old arts. Yet even they could not scrub seiðr from the bones of the land. Its shadow endures in folklore, the hag who curses a careless hunter, the charm buried beneath the threshold, the sudden misfortune blamed on a spiteful neighbour's hidden hand. In the end, the line that seiðr crossed was not written in ink or carved in runes. It was etched in the Norse soul, the knowledge that true power comes at a price, and that sometimes the sharpest blade is the one no one sees until it slips between the ribs of fate itself. To the Norse, the world did not end at their fjords and forests. Beyond the known settlements lay a wilder realm, deep pine woods, frozen marshes, and the endless sweep of tundra where reindeer drifted like ghosts across the snow. In this borderland lived a people the Vikings both traded with and feared, the Sami. To the sagas, the Sami were called finna or laps, forest dwellers whose ways slipped like smoke through the fingers of Norse kings and jarls. They were hunters and herders, following herds of reindeer across lands where iron ships and ploughs were worthless. But more than this, they were sorcerers, at least in the eyes of the Vikings, who crept north to barter furs and silver and returned whispering of magic older than any rune carved by mortal hands. It is said the Sami could whistle the winds awake, that they knew the ways of beasts so deeply that they could slip inside their skins, walk unseen beside the wolf or the bear. To the Norse mind, this made them uncanny a people who belonged more to the spirits than to the villages that clung to the coasts. In the winter markets of the far north, where Norse traders spread out iron tools and cloth in exchange for fox pelts and seal oil, men traded more than goods. They traded stories. One merchant might boast of a Sami noidi, a shaman who conjured good hunting with a drum carved from reindeer hide. Another swore that he saw a storm rise from clear skies because a Sami had muttered a single word after being cheated of a fair price. The heart of Sami magic was the noadi, the spirit walker. These shamans were more than healers or wise folk. They were bridges between the living and the hidden world beneath the snow and pine roots. In their hands was the rune, a round drum painted with signs that made Norse runes seem crude by comparison: sun, wind, bear, hunter, reindeer, herd, all bound together in a map of the world's secret bones. When the noadi beat the drum, the sound was said to loosen the skin from the soul. The shaman's breath slowed. His eyes fluttered like a man on the edge of sleep. Those who watched sometimes Norse traders, more often trembling kin, swore he drifted free, walking paths that only spirits trod, bargaining with beings who cared nothing for coin or kinship. The Norse feared this power deeply, for here was magic that did not come from carved runes or hidden poles, but from a closeness to the land itself. The Sami did not need the All-Father's sacrifice for knowledge. They sat beneath the aurora's dancing lights and drank wisdom from the wind. Some chieftains sought this power for themselves. A jarlsman in Hologaland, so the tale goes, paid a Sami noadi with silver and sealskins to curse the sails of a rival fleet. The noadi vanished into the woods for 3 nights. When he returned, he gave the jarl a bundle of reindeer hair and whispered a word in his ear. Days later, a storm smashed the rival ships against hidden shoals, and the jarl's coffers fattened with salvage. Whether the storm rose by chance or by curse mattered little. The tale grew legs that carried fear from hearth to hearth. Unlike the Norse seiðr-workers, who needed ritual spaces and runes, the Sami carried their magic wherever they went. A drum, a staff of birch, a pouch of powdered bones, these were enough. They called the winds, they soothed sickness, they spoke to the fish under frozen rivers. To Norse, farmers clinging to rocky soil and short harvests, such power seemed too slippery, too dangerous, a bargain that might twist back on any man bold enough to reach for it. Some sagas speak of Viking raiders who dared strike deep into Sami lands, thinking to tame the traders who walked the line between kin and foreigner. Few returned whole. One tale, half myth and half warning, tells of a band of Norsemen who stole a sacred drum from a Sami village near the White Sea. They mocked its painted symbols, used it to light their campfire for warmth. That night, a storm rose, not of snow, but of silence. When the sun rose again, every man was found frozen where he sat, eyes open wide, lips black with frost, the drum whole again beside their stiff hands. To the Norse, the greatest terror was not that the Sami could strike a man dead, but that they might steal his luck. Haminga, the soul's fortune, could be robbed by a whispered chant or a painted drum. A warrior might wield the finest sword of Ulfbert steel and still find it dull if the Noaid's curse turned his luck to ice. Yet fear and trade are brothers in the north. For every warning about Sami sorcery, there was a merchant's eager nod toward the profits. Sami hunters traded the finest furs, black fox, white ermine, prized from the dens of the far tundra where Norse traps failed. They guided Viking traders along rivers that snaked like veins through forests, so deep the sun seemed a rumour. And when the bargain was struck, a wise trader left a gift, salt, iron, bright beads, to keep the Noaid's favour sweet. Christian priests, when they spread their crosses into these frozen borderlands, railed against the Noaid's drum. They burned them when they could, shattered painted staves, forced new converts to bury old ways. But the Sami were people of mist, and drift they hid their drums in caves, wrapped their chants in Christian words, whispered the old names when the snow fell thick, and the priests sat safely by their own hearths. Today, in the far corners of Scandinavia, where reindeer still drift across winter hills, echoes of this old fear linger. The painted drums, the wind songs, the half-glimpsed shapes moving between pines at dusk, remind us that once, to the Norse, the greatest terror was not the clash of longships, but a single man in furs, kneeling beneath the northern lights, whispering to powers the Viking blade could never touch. For every axe raised in a Viking hall, there was a whispered fear that not all ruin came from blades. Sometimes it crept through bloodlines, a sickness of luck that passed from father to son, mother to daughter, like a shadow carried in the marrow. For the Norse knew that even kings could be cursed, and when a king fell, his whole dynasty might crumble under the unseen weight of hidden malice. In the age of jarls and petty kings, power was fragile. A crown was only as strong as the kin who stood behind it and the luck that wove them together. But luck could fray. And when it did, whispers followed, that somewhere a seiðr-worker had carved runes into a stick of driftwood and buried it beneath the king's hall, that a rival queen had poured grave dust into his drinking horn, that a single word, spoken in spite, had seeded ruin deep in the family's veins. One of the oldest sagas hints at this dread. The Yngling dynasty, the semi-legendary line that claimed descent from Frey himself, carried a story that its kings fell by unnatural ends. A king drowned in his own ale vat, Another was suffocated by a wolf skin drawn over his head while he slept. One chieftain, Halfdan the Black, broke through spring ice while crossing a frozen fjord, his body swallowed by dark water. To the Skalds, these deaths were no accidents. They were fate, tangled by old magic and rival envy. In the Volsunga saga, the tale of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, there coils a darker example. Sigurd's bloodline, mighty and bright as a summer sun, is ruined by a curse that begins with a ring and Varanort stolen from a dwarf who spat a curse upon it before yielding it up. Every hand that holds the ring bleeds for it. Kings rise and fall, heroes betray kin, mothers dream of wolf's teeth. The ring becomes more than treasure. It is a spell, binding ruin to all who crave its gold. In such tales, wealth and power are double-edged. They attract envy, and envy feeds curses. A wise king kept a cunning woman near, not just for blessings, but for unbinding. The Norse believed that a curse laid properly could cling for generations. One chieftain's sin, an oath broken, a guest betrayed, a rival wronged, could plant rot deep in the roots of his line. His heirs might inherit wide fields, silver, strong ships, yet their luck would sour like milk left too long under a summer sun. Not all doomed lines were born of whispered spells alone. Sometimes the kings brought ruin on themselves by crossing the seiðr line, by trusting sorcery too deeply, by binding their power to hidden arts that turned back like a serpent biting its master's hand. A tale from the Landnámabók, Iceland's Book of Settlements, tells of a chieftain who wished to ensure his heir's rule forever. He sought out a Sami Noedi and paid him in gold and bearskins to bind the family's haminga to the land itself. So long as they tended the old gods, the line would flourish. But when his grandson broke the pact, cutting sacred groves to build a new hall, the family's luck fled overnight. A storm drowned their herds. Sickness took the children. Within 2 generations, the name was ash on the wind. In these stories, curses are not only traps set by rivals, they are debts unpaid to spirits, oaths betrayed, ancient bargains broken by pride. A dynasty is only strong if its luck runs clear. And luck, to the Norse, was a living thing. It could be hoarded like silver, stolen like cattle, or poisoned at its source. Skalds knew how to sing these tales in ways that shivered the bones of kings. In great halls, they would stand by the hearth, recounting old wrongs in half-sung verses, each line a reminder that power was never absolute, that beneath every throne might lie a grave mound whispering ruin. Even Christianity did not wash these fears away. When Harold Bluetooth bent knee to the White Christ, he did so partly to cleanse his line-stained luck, but rivals said the old gods would not be so easily forsaken. In the years that followed, his family's power fractured. Sons turned against fathers. Vassals rebelled. To the priests, these were signs of divine will. To the old families who remembered the seiðr women and the old ways, it was proof that no king could slip a curse by changing the name of his god. Sometimes the ruin came as a whisper that turned brother against brother. In the Orkneys, the Earls of Orkney fought among themselves for generations, each suspecting the other of witchcraft. The Orkneyinga saga hints at hidden women who stirred the pot Seithgunur paid in secret to twist the luck of one earl so another's sails might catch the wind first. The result was endless blood feud, skull split after skull split, a line so tangled in betrayal that no single blade could cut it clean. The marks of these fears remain even in the ground. In burial mounds across Scandinavia, archaeologists have found strange additions. Iron knives laid crosswise above the bones, wolf skulls buried near the threshold, runic sticks blackened by fire. Some say these were safeguards, last desperate measures to bind a curse within the grave, so that a dead king's spite could not slip out to drag down the living. And in the folk tales that linger long after the sagas faded, there remain echoes of doomed dynasties, farmsteads where no heir grows old, valleys where herds sicken generation after generation. In these quiet places, a man might still stand in the hush before dawn, staring at his frozen fields, wondering whose ancient envy runs like poison in his blood. In the Viking mind, all lines must one day break, but the greatest terror was that the break would come not by sword or spear, but by a word whispered long ago, a rune buried deep, where roots grow and the past never truly sleeps. In the Viking age, power was not only won by the axe, but by the tongue. Among the most honoured men in any Norse assembly was the Logsagumother, the law speaker. He was the living memory of the people's rights and oaths, the keeper of ancient verdicts, the one who spoke aloud the law at the thing, so none could claim ignorance. His voice bound feuds, sealed deals, and settled who owed silver for blood spilt in shadowed valleys. Yet even the law speaker, the mouthpiece of order, was not beyond the reach of curses. For if you poisoned the law speaker's tongue, you poisoned the whole thing. A people who could not trust the man who spoke the law was a people on the brink of chaos. And so, behind the clash of shield and sword, lingered a quieter fear that a single curse might silence the voice that held the North together. Picture the Thingstead at Tringvalir in Iceland, the great plain where men gathered each summer, their tents bright splashes against the mossy rock. Here, the law speaker stood upon the law rock, a natural outcrop where he recited the ancient codes 3 summers at a time. His voice carried across the assembly, weaving the old words into fresh disputes, reminding each man where he stood in the web of kin and debt. But beneath this public show lay private shadows. A wealthy farmer, fined too harshly for cutting timber from a neighbour's grove, might whisper his grudge into the ears of a cunning woman. A chieftain whose claim was struck down by a single spoken line might find a seiðr-worker waiting at the edge of the Thingstead, ready to trade a charm for silver or favour. The sagas hint at these hidden blows. One tale tells of Thorgils the Silver-Tongued, a law speaker of high repute, whose words once bound a feud so bitter that blood feud seemed certain. By sheer force of memory and wit, Thorgils brought the feuding families to a settlement, but not without planting seeds of hate among those forced to yield. Months later, when Thorgils rose again at the thing, his voice cracked mid-sentence. The words fell from his mouth like frost-cracked ice. He stammered, choked, and could not finish the law. Witnesses spoke of a strange mark, found later beneath his sleeping bench, a rune stave inked on lambskin, buried in the rushes. Whether sickness or spell, none could say. But Thorgils never spoke clear again. His tongue tripped on old lines, his memory failed him, and by next thing he was replaced a man shamed. The power that once made him honoured now fled as surely as luck from a cursed blade. Such tales fed a constant dread at assemblies. The law speaker was watched as closely as a king, not only by rivals who might catch him in error, but by those who feared what might slip into his food or under his bedding. Some kept seiðr-workers on retainer for protection, a whispered charm to bind the cunning of rivals, to guard against hexes, slipped through careless cracks. In the Gragas Iceland's medieval Law Code 1 finds strange, half-buried hints of this fear. There were punishments for fylkingi harmful witchcraft, but no easy way to prove its use. If a man fell mute or lost his wits, was it bad luck, age, or secret malice? The law could judge only what it saw, and the most dangerous curses left no mark. To guard his tongue, the wise law speaker kept iron close, a knife under the bed, a nail driven into the doorpost of his booth. Some wore Thor's hammer around their necks, Mjolnir, the ward against hidden ruin. And before the thing opened, many law speakers walked alone to a quiet stream or grove to speak prayers to Odin, the god who gave the gift of speech and memory, but who also knew how to twist words like threads on a loom. Sometimes it was not a rival's curse, but his own mistakes that made a law speaker vulnerable. The North was a web of pride and thin skins. One word twisted wrong could breed grudges that outlived the speaker himself. If a verdict cut too close to a chieftain's pride, if a fine emptied a man's coffers, then knives might come before curses did. But when blades failed or risked open feud, whispers took their place. A fragment of saga from the eastern fjords tells of a low-born farmer, Eric Horsebane, who lost his fields in a border ruling. Too poor to fight in court again, he found an old woman who lived alone beside a peat bog. They say she took a single strand of the law speaker's hair, burned it with grave dust, and buried the ash beneath a boundary stone. By spring, the law speaker's wife miscarried 3 children in 3 seasons. His name soured, his line failed, and Eric, so the tale goes, reclaimed his fields when no heir rose to claim them. Whether true or not, such stories bound the people's minds, as surely as the thing bound their laws. They reminded every man that the law was not a wall of stone, but a song sung by a single throat, and that throat could be closed forever if envy found the right hidden key. To stand on the law rock and speak centuries of memory was an honour few dared lightly. It meant mastery over words, a mind that could hold the past like an iron chest. But in the North, words were never just sounds. They were threads of power, and threads could be cut or tangled or turned against their weaver with a single cursed knot. Even now, where the law rock still rises by the rivers of Ingvalir, visitors stand and speak the old lines for the echo alone. Few know how once a whisper beneath a sleeping mat, a rune carved on lambskin, could make that echo falter, and with it, the whole fragile order that held axe and law in balance beneath the wide, indifferent sky. When the Vikings spoke of power, they spoke of blood. Blood-sealed oaths, fed the gods, hallowed the land. But blood was also the secret fire that made a curse burn hotter and strike deeper than mere words alone. For in the oldest magic of the North, the hidden arts of seiðr were never only about whispered runes or carved staves. They were about sacrifice. Flesh given to spirits, life spilled to bind a spell. Imagine a dark night on the edge of a pine grove. A woman kneels in the hush between snow and moss, her cloak drawn tight against the wind. In her hand she holds a black cockerel, its wings bound in twine. Around her, stones mark a circle, scraped clear of needles and frost. At its centre, half buried in the earth, lies a small wooden stave runes carved deep and sharp enough to bite a thumb. The seiðr-workers whispers to the trees, or to something that listens beyond the trees. She tips the bird's neck back, her knife flashes once, and the blood runs hot across the cold ground, soaking into the rune stave. It is not enough to speak a curse, it must be fed. The blood is an offering, a bribe, a threat, a pact with the hidden world that says, "Take this life, and with it strike the one whose name I speak." Such scenes were not spoken of openly in the bright halls where Jarls feasted. They happened at the fringes in forest clearings, on cold beaches under the new moon, in sod huts where the hearth never burned quite warm enough to feel safe. Yet the old poems, the Eddas, hint at sacrifice in the making of curses as much as in the blessing of kings. The sagas speak more plainly if you read between their lines. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson tells of a carved horse head placed atop a pole a nithing erected to curse a rival. But what the skalds did not say outright was that the horse was not just killed, it was sacrificed. The pole's curse drew strength from the horse's life, a gift torn from the mundane world and thrown into the hungry darkness. To the Norse mind, blood was the bridge between worlds. A cow's throat cut at the start of winter, a goat slain at a harvest feast, these were gifts to the gods, reminders that life fed life, that death turned the wheel so spring might come again. But when that blood was given not to Thor or Freya, but to the darker roots beneath the earth to bind ruin to a man's luck, it was a twisting of the natural order. Powerful, yes, but perilous. Not all sacrifice for cursing was animal flesh. Some spells demanded offerings cut closer to the bone, hair clipped secretly from an enemy's head, fingernail parings scraped from a sleeping child. A drop of blood, willingly given by the one who spoke the words. These scraps of the living soul were potent keys. To bind them to a rune stave, to bury them with grave dust or ash, was to stitch the victim's life to the spell so tightly that tearing one free would shred the other. A tale from the far north tells of a chieftain's daughter who sought revenge for her father's murder. She found a seiðr-worker who promised justice, but only if she paid with something precious. The girl cut 3 locks from her own hair and let the old woman mix them with the blood of a lamb, fresh cut in the snow. They say the killer's luck turned that winter, his ships dashed on reefs, his cattle found dead in the night. The daughter's line flourished, but whispers claimed her dreams were forever haunted by shadows of lambs crying in the dark. Even warriors, who scorned hidden magic, sometimes sought its secret edge. Before raids, berserkers swore oaths over sacrificed rams or goats, their blood smeared on axe blades. They roared into the night, biting their shields, but beneath the roar was the quiet dread that if they fell in battle, their blood too would bind some hidden curse, feeding a rival's spite long after their bones lay cold. Sacrificial cursing blurred the line between crime and right. To kill an animal openly for the gods was lawful, a blot, a gift. But to spill blood in secret, to feed spirits that answered only to the seiðr-workers' tongue, that was dangerous ground. The thing could outlaw a man for open murder. But for a lamb's blood spilled under a new moon, who would know, unless the curse bloomed so fully that tongues wagged and fingers pointed? Some old farmsteads still yield evidence of these shadow rites. Buried bones in boundary lines, sheep skulls split open and laid beneath doorways, iron knives stuck through ribs as if to bind a restless power in place. Archaeologists argue whether these were protection or threat, but in the world of the Norse, the difference was often a matter of who spoke the words. When Christianity came to the fjords and valleys, the priests condemned such sacrifices as pagan devilry. Yet they knew enough of fear to wield it well. They recast the sacrifice as a bargain with demons, a soul lost in exchange for ruin, visited on a neighbour's field. Church courts hunted seiðr-workers, burned their tools, salted the places where they once made offerings to spirits older than any Christ-born saint. Yet even under the new cross, the old hunger for blood-bound magic survived in whispered corners. In remote upland farms, folk still whispered that to end a feud for good, one might bury a rooster alive beneath a threshold, its muffled cries binding the feud's luck to the cold earth forever. A bitter charm, half forgotten but never truly gone. Blood was life, life was power, and power, once spoken into the dark, did not care if it served a god or a grudge. It moved through the soil, it lingered in bone, it stained the runes carved by trembling hands under the endless watch of moon and pine. So when you hear the old tales of Viking curses, remember, words alone were sharp, but words sharpened with sacrifice were blades. No warrior's shield could turn. Amid the cold waters of the Baltic Sea lies Gotland, an island that, in the age of the Vikings, was more than a wind-bitten outpost. It was crossroads and threshold, trade hub and burial ground, a place where merchant ships brought silver from the east and gossip from the west, and where stones whispered secrets older than any king's hall. To the unknowing eye, Gotland's stones seem like any others. They stand in open fields, half lost among grazing sheep or moss-cloaked pine forests. They lean crooked in churchyards that came long after the old gods fled before the cross. Some bear simple crosses, signs of new faith. But others wear stranger marks, snakes that coil endlessly, warriors with horned helmets that never saw battle, runes whose meanings drift like sea mist. These are the picture stones Bildstenar, great slabs of limestone carved and raised by hands that understood that stone could do more than mark a grave. It could bind a promise, preserve a name, and some whisper carry a curse so long as the stone still stands. The runes on Gotland's stones speak with half-closed lips. Some are simple. Here lies Asmundr, may God bless him. But a few coil with darker words. One stone, half buried near Torsbergen, carries a warning in its lines. Let he who moves me find no luck, no harvest, no home. Who carved it, no saga says. Yet the threat clings to the stone, like frost to old bark. To the people of Gotland, such curses were more than idle threats. In a land where farmland clings like green cloth to rocky bones, every inch was precious. Boundary stones marked who owned which field, who claimed the right to gather driftwood or graze sheep along the stony shore. To move a stone was to steal, but to curse a stone was to guard it with fear, as strong as any spear wall. Some stones were never meant to stand alone. They guarded burial mounds, not only as markers for the dead, but as bindings for the restless spirits beneath. For in the Old Norse belief, the dead could slip their mounds if unquiet, their envy or spite drifting out like cold fog to sour a living man's luck. A carved stone, raised with the right runes, could pin a spirit down or turn its hunger outward, striking any who dared disturb its sleep. Travellers from the mainland told tales of Gotland's stones that bled. One such story, caught in the notes of a passing monk, centuries later, speaks of a farmer who broke a picture stone to build a new barn. By spring his cattle sickened, his wife miscarried 3 times, and his sons drowned in a sudden squall, while fishing waters they had sailed safely all their lives. The stone's curse was blamed. When the barn fell in a storm the next year, no one rebuilt it. Runologists today study the curling lines and stylized beasts carved deep into Gotland's stones, arguing over what is threat and what is boast. Some claim the runes are simple prayers, appeals to Thor or Christ to guard the sleeper beneath. Others see warnings hidden in bind runes, twisted staves that speak 2 meanings at once. Hug, the mind, or Holger, the mound. Vague, the way, or vague, ruin. The Norse tongue was slippery in skilled hands. A few stones stand apart for the images they hold. Riders on horses that climb skyward into spiral shapes. Warriors with shields raised against serpent coils. Women standing with arms lifted, palms outward, a gesture that some scholars see as warding, others as blessing, still others as a sign of summoning something unseen. Were these images charms to protect the grave, or threats to any who might break it open for the silver buried with the bones? The people of Gotland did not raise their stones lightly. To carve runes was costly work, paid for in traded silver, and days stolen from farm and sea. Yet the stones endure where memory fails. The living tongue forgets the words, but the stone remembers. When Christianity crept into Gotland's villages, the priests ordered crosses chipped into older stones as sanctification by force. Yet beneath the new marks, the old runes lingered, defiant scratches that told the land whose bones lay beneath and what ruin waited for the greedy hand that might shift the stone for plunder. Even today, farmers speak softly of stones best left unmoved. In hedgerows and forest edges, half-sunken slabs stand at odd angles. Some say to dig near them is to court misfortune. Tools break, livestock sicken, crops rot in the field for no reason. A priest's blessing can mend. Scholars scoff and measure. They photograph the runes, chart the angles of the serpent knots, debate whether this twist means curse or commemoration. But on a wet spring night, when the wind hums low through Gotland's fields and sheep huddle close to low stone fences, the old stories crawl back out like mice from dry walls. That the stones are more than monuments, they are gates, seals, locks of word and stone that bind the past tight. What fear gave birth to these carved threats? Perhaps a father who lost his land to trickery, binding his last patch of soil with a stone no man would dare shift. Perhaps a clan who buried their greatest warrior with silver stolen in raids, knowing envy breeds grave robbers as surely as night follows dusk. Or perhaps a cunning woman, standing by the mound at dusk, whispering runes into fresh carved lines, so that when her enemy's grandson came to break the stone for ploughshares, the curse would find him waiting. Gotland's curse stones remind us that the Vikings did not see the world as fixed lines on a map, but as a shifting weave of luck and promise, threat and blessing, all bound together by word and deed. And the word carved in stone was a word that could not be unsaid, not while the wind still carried frost across old fields, not while sheep still graze among mossy mounds. So if you walk among Gotland's stones one day, pause a moment, run your hand over the cold surface, feel the grooves where some long-dead carver pressed iron into limestone, listen to the wind, and wonder whose look sleeps there still, and what hand, in foolish greed, might one day wake it. In the world of the Vikings, where the line between blessing and curse was a thin thread spun by cunning hands, the seiðr-workers the witch was both needed and feared. She walked a knife's edge between hearth and exile, protection and ruin. One wrong whisper, one rumour carried on the wind, and the same village that knelt at her door in winter's hunger would drive her into the wilderness, with curses spat behind her back. They called her seiðr-workers when they needed her wise woman, knower of roots, weaver of hidden words. But when her power bit too deep, when envy or fear soured her name, they called her trollkona, witch, monster. And the North knew what to do with monsters. Imagine a farmstead on the edge of a fjord. The snow has begun to melt. The rivers swell with cold, dark water. The fields are mud, the sheep thin, the stores nearly gone. In the longhouse, a child coughs weakly beside the hearth. A father leans on his staff, hollow-eyed, and says to his wife in a voice rough as old rope, "Fetch her." And so, wrapped in furs, the woman trudges to the edge of the woods, where a hut squats beneath leaning birch trees. Inside, the seiðr-workers waits. Her hair is grey as frost on peat, her fingers stained with the sap of herbs and the blood of small things snared in secret traps. She listens to the mother's plea, the coins pressed into her palm, the whispered bargain. She goes to the farm, mutters her charms, burns bitter herbs that smoke and sting the eyes. By spring, the child lives, the sheep fatten. For a time, her name drifts through the hall in thankful voices. But gratitude rots fast in hard seasons. Come next winter, when the calf is stillborn or the barley fails, people remember the old woman differently. Who knows what else she called when she muttered by the hearth? Who can say what spirits fed on that smoke? Envy festers. A neighbour's cow wanders off a cliff. Did she turn its eyes? A chieftain's son limps home from a raid, arm withered with strange sickness. Did she spit his name into the dark? In the sagas, there is always a price for power that moves unseen. And when that price feels too steep, the people pay it not in silver, but in fear and fury. They gather at the Thing, the open-air court where free men speak their grievances and shape the law with oaths and judgments. There, beneath drifting clouds and the distant cry of seabirds, the accusations fall like stones. She cursed my child. She spoiled my field. I found a rune stick under my threshold. Who else could have placed it? The law of the North in these matters was half word, half whisper. The Gragas forbade harmful magic, but gave no clear path to prove it. There were no marks to show the thing, no wound to bind in linen. Only the trembling voice of the accuser, the cold eyes of neighbours, who weighed old favours against fresh fears. Sometimes the thing ruled for banishment, a sentence that cut deeper than rope or iron. To be cast out was to lose the hearth's warmth, the gossip by the fire, the ring of kinship that bound all free folk together. Alone, a woman might survive for a while, snaring rabbits, gathering moss and herbs, trading secret knowledge for food left at the edge of fields. But her name became a curse in itself. Mothers warned children, "Stray too far into the woods, and she will find you." One saga tells of Gunhild, called Crow Voice, a seiðr-worker whose herbs once healed half a valley when fever swept the sheep herds. Years later, when a chieftain's house burned on a still night, the people whispered of Gunhild's envy. They claimed they had seen her near the fjord, speaking to the wind. The Thing found her guilty without a blade drawn. They tied her staff into 3 pieces and flung it into the river, then drove her out with torches and stones. Her tracks vanished into the pine woods, and they say that in winters after, men heard a crow's harsh call when snow fell too deep, when calves shivered in the barn. Banishment was not always final. Some cunning women fled far enough that fear turned to rumour, rumour to legend. In the wastes beyond the settled farms, a banished witch might find kin among the Sami, those who understood the drum's voice and the hidden roots beneath frozen moss. Some returned years later in secret, their faces hidden beneath fur hoods, offering charms or vengeance to those desperate enough to bargain with an exile. But for most, exile was a slow death. The North is not kind to the lonely. Wolves stalk the edges of human warmth, winter gnaws at flesh and hope alike. And yet, in the cold heart of banishment, the witch's power did not always fade sometimes. It grew sharper. Cut from hearth and kin, a seiðr-worker owed nothing to the village that cast her out. She answered to older, hungrier things. In the hush of snow-buried forests, a banished witch might shape curses that no thing could bind. Legends coil around this truth. Farmers tell of boundary stones that should not be moved, not because of the old clan who laid claim, but because of the outcast who bound her spite into the soil before she vanished. Children tell stories of lights flickering between dark trees, the witch's lantern, calling wanderers to sleep beneath drifts that never thaw. Priests came in time, swinging their iron crosses, chanting Latin prayers against the last cunning women clinging to the woods. They called them witches in the devil's service, hunted them with fire and rope. Yet even the priests knew enough to speak soft when the wind howled through the birches at dusk. For the North never fully forgot that the witch, the seiðr-worker, the banished one she was, the shadow they shaped and cast away, the echo of their own fear, a reminder that in a land ruled by sword and shield, The sharpest wound could come from a woman's tongue, a hidden rune, a curse whispered where no hearth's warmth could reach. When the white Christ came to the north, he came not only on the tongues of wandering priests or the sails of kings eager for foreign allies. He came as a hammer raised against the old hidden arts. For the new faith brought new words for old fears, and it called a curse what the Norse had long called a binding, a blessing turned backwards, a word twisted in the dark. In the longhouses and thingsteads, the first priests found a people both stubborn and curious. They accepted baptism in river shallows, and then returned to hang Thor's hammer around their necks, just in case. They listened to psalms beneath carved beams where runes still lingered in the shadows. They spoke the Lord's Prayer, but still buried iron knives under thresholds to keep a cunning neighbour's envy at bay. The new faith preached that magic was sin, unless worked by the saints or Christ's appointed servants. A rune stick that bound a cow's milk to flow sweetly was not a charm, but a temptation of the devil. A seiðr-workers' chant to soothe a child's fever was witchcraft, if not done with a priest's Latin blessing. In this clash, the quiet power of the old words withered in the open, but retreated deeper into shadows, or turned defiant. In the Icelandic law code Gragas, crafted during the uneasy centuries, when pagan and Christian custom wrestled side by side, Viking harmful magic was punishable by outlawry or worse. But how to prove it? A rune stick burned to ash leaves no mark. A whispered curse rides the wind where no witness can follow. So suspicion and rumour became the hidden courts. A man's luck turned sour. His cattle failed, someone must have spoken ill of him. Someone must have turned the old craft against him in secret. The priests, for their part, built churches beside thingsteads and old burial mounds, staking their crosses like spears into the soft turf of ancient fear. They blessed the boundary stones, carved crosses over runes, made farmers swear oaths to abandon heathen superstition. Yet the north is wide and wind broken. Beyond the reach of church bells, in upland valleys and ice-rimmed fjords, the old habits clung like lichen on stone. Some cunning women took the cross into their own hands. They wove prayers for saints among their old charms. They whispered paternoster over the same herbs that once bore Freya's name. And still, if a child coughed too long, if a cow calved dead 3 seasons running, neighbours would knock on her door. Coins clutched tight, the priest none the wiser. But when hunger bit or envy festered, these same neighbours turned quick. The new faith gave them a sharper blade to strike with: sin, witch, servant of Satan. The church courts promised absolution for those who confessed to using dark arts and ruin for those who clung to them. The old seiðr, once a cunning craft to bend luck and weather, now was named pact with the devil. This war sharpened across the centuries. By the late Middle Ages, long after Viking sails had rotted to driftwood, the north trembled under waves of witch hunts. Tales tell of women burned at the stake for curses that once would have been settled with a feud or outlawry. A girl who dreamed too vividly, an old midwife whose herbs worked too well, both might find themselves dragged before a bishop's court. Yet the roots ran deep. In remote farms, a nail still slid beneath a lintel to ward off hidden envy. A shepherd still spat thrice over a newborn lamb to break any lurking charm. A mother still whispered a rhyme over the butter churn so her neighbour's spite would not sour the cream. The shape of the words changed, but the dread remained. Priests themselves sometimes turned the old fear to their own ends. In the Norwegian valleys, parish records speak of cunning men called to break curses in Christ's name. Men who knew the Psalms, but also kept old charms hidden in the folds of their cassocks. They muttered Latin over barren cows, scattered blessed salt at pasture edges, poured holy water on doorposts where a rune stave might once have been buried. The church did not always banish the old magic. Sometimes it dressed it in new colours and called it virtue. In Gotland and Iceland, the stones bore witness. Picture stones, inscribed with crosses, stand over graves where bones rest, alongside iron knives meant to pin the spirit tight. Runic inscriptions, half erased by Christian hands, still linger beneath moss and frost. To scratch away the old words was easy, to scratch away the fear they named was far harder. Some kings themselves blurred the line. Olaf Tryggvason, Harold Bluetooth, Olaf Haraldsson, these men wore the cross like a crown, but knew well that curses did not vanish with a baptism splash. They wielded priests and cunning men alike, binding their people's dread of the hidden arts into royal power. A rival's ship caught by sudden squalls? Praise Saint Olaf, but perhaps a cunning priest whispered something darker into the wind. In time, the church's grip tightened, the fire's roar replaced the thing's verdicts. But in the hush of pine forests, old women still spoke of grave dust and buried runes, of charms so old even the priests feared to name them. Children huddled by winter hearths to hear tales of the witch banished into snowdrifts, yet mothers still tucked iron shears under cradles to keep tiny bones safe from unseen hands. So Christianity's war on curses was never truly won. It buried the old words under stone churches and churchyard walls. It burned the cunning women's tools and salted the ashes. But the fear that words might twist fate, that envy might creep beneath the door, that luck might be stolen with a whispered name, that fear still curls like smoke through the oldest farmhouses and the deepest fjords. Wherever the wind howls across sod roofs and frost rattles birch leaves in the dark, the Viking curse breathes, yet waiting for the tongue bold enough or desperate enough to call it back into the world. Beneath the fields where tractors now grumble and iron ploughs turn the old earth, secrets still wait slivers of the North's hidden fear, the whispered weapons of a people who knew that luck was never only chance. Long after the longships vanished, the ground remembers, and sometimes it gives back what was hidden, the forgotten charms that once struck dread in the hearts of even the fiercest Norse warrior. Archaeologists in Scandinavia speak quietly of these finds. They appear when least expected. A farmer mending a stone wall unearths a rune stick, blackened by age, runes carved so faint they seem like scratches at first glance. A child digging for worms in a pasture pulls up a sliver of bone, drilled through, runes snaking around its curve. Pieces that do not belong to the proud rune stones that name the dead, but to the secret curses buried beneath doorways, thresholds, fields. One of the most haunting finds came from the damp soil of Ribe in Denmark, a wooden rune stave, carved with a binding meant to twist the health of livestock, simple, unadorned. A thin slip of wood, lost or hidden by the very hand that made it. Scholars read its runes and wonder who was the target. What feud, half lost to frost and centuries, drove someone to bury words sharp enough to cut a man's luck at the roots? In Gotland, the island where rune stones stand like silent watchers among sheep pastures, more than a dozen iron amulets have turned up in graves. Some bear Thor's hammer, easy enough to name as protection, but others hold marks whose meaning lies just out of reach. Bind, runes, coiled like serpents eating their tails, lines that do not match known blessings, but echo old threats. Some archaeologists claim these were defensive charms. Others say they were weapons in disguise carried not to ward off misfortune, but to send it crawling under a rival's roof. And then there are the iron staffs found buried alongside women in mounds that once rose proudly above fjords and meadows. Seiðr-workers' staffs, some say keys to the hidden arts, wands of power that spoke to spirits beneath the soil. One such staff, unearthed near Firkat in Denmark, lay beside a woman dressed in silks and beads, a figure of respect or dread. The staff's head curls into iron shapes like a serpent coiled in waiting. Scholars debate, was this a mark of a healer, a seeress, or the very tool that tied spoken curses to the living world? Among the strangest relics are the so-called trollkers, troll crosses. In Sweden's forests, these twisted loops of iron sometimes surface near old farmsteads. Folk tales say they were bent by hand to ward off malevolent spirits, trolls, or witches who might slip a curse through the door. But some believe the troll cross was not only a shield, but a snare that cunning hands twisted iron not just to guard, but to bind an enemy's ill will and turn it back upon him threefold. The soil of Iceland, too, yields its secrets. In turf walls that once sheltered sheep from bitter winds, farmers find small pouches of hair and bone wrapped in scraps of hide. They are the husks of old Gulda-spoken spells, once buried to rot a rival's luck. A few hold herbs, whose bitter taste once turned milk sour. Some keep scraps of parchment, ink faded to brown dust, bearing prayers that twist between Latin and runes a strange mingling of Christ's tongue and the old tongue of Odin. Each fragment is a window into a hidden war that once ran beneath the roar of battle and the clang of iron at the thing. For every axe swung in open feud, a rune stick lay buried where no man could see. For every proud oath shouted in a longhouse, a whisper slid beneath the door with grave dust, and a charm tucked under a threshold stone. To hold these pieces now is to feel the cold edge of a fear that never truly vanished. Archaeologists handle them with gloves, clean them gently, photograph every cut and line. They speak of them in journals and lectures, apotropaic objects. They call them protective magic, popular superstition, yet the air shifts when one is placed in a museum glass case, the soft hum of old dread rising like breath from a mound cracked by frost. Visitors stand and peer through the glass modern eyes, tracing runes whose meanings flicker just beyond translation. Some smile, call it folklore, a curiosity from an age before reason and science banished monsters into myth. Yet even they step a little closer to the sign that says, "Buried beneath a barn threshold, c. 950 CE. And they wonder who buried it, whose envy did it bind, whose luck did it poison. For in these scraps of iron, bone, and wood lies the heartbeat of the Viking fear that words could shape the world more sharply than blades, that a whisper, sealed with a sign, could reach farther than any spear thrust, that the fiercest Jarl might fall not in battle, but in his sleep, his luck gnawed by a hidden rune that no sword could parry. And if the wind sighs just right through the halls where these relics now lie, you might almost hear the echo of the one who carved the stave or twisted the iron, a farmer's wife kneeling by a doorframe under a new moon, a seiðr-worker crouched by a burial mound, pressing grave dust into lambskin, a child told to carry a token to a fence line where two fields meet the invisible frontier, where envy brews ruin. So the next time you hear that the Viking Age was only axes, raids, and sagas sung by roaring hearths, remember the quiet relics, the tiny rune sticks, the troll crosses, the grave dust pouches tucked under turf. They are the shadows beneath the iron and the stories. They are the reason that, for all their swords and sails, the people of the north still feared the word carved in secret more than the blade raised in plain sight. Long after the last dragon-prowed longship rotted into peat, long after the runes on gravestones weathered to faint grooves beneath moss and lichen, the fear of Viking curses lingered not only in the soil, but in the whispered memory of generations who could not quite lay them to rest. In the far fjords of Norway, in the forests of Sweden, and the wind-bitten turf farms of Iceland, echoes of the old dread survived the centuries when priests rang their bells and kings carved new laws in Latin script. People might kneel before Christ's cross on Sunday, but in the hush of a winter night, they still muttered old words to bind envy and turn aside a hidden spite. Stories drift through the north like frost on a still lake, tales of the last cunning women who carried the remnants of seiðr in secret. In some valleys, people spoke of the last curse, a final venomous word that an old witch might leave behind, woven so tightly into field or family that no priest's blessing could quite lift it. One fragment of folk memory from the 1600s speaks of a woman called Liv of the Stones. Her house sat on the edge of a wind-scoured pasture where sheep sometimes vanished without trace. Some say her mother taught her runes at a time when such marks would earn a pyre's flame. When her land was taken by a wealthier farmer, aided by the new laws brought by Danish rule, Liv gathered a stone from the old burial field nearby. She scraped a line of runes on it by firelight, sealed it with spit, and whispered spite. The tale claims the new owner's cattle dropped dead one by one until the farm fell to ruin, the fields left to bracken and foxes. Long after Liv's bones lay cold in the churchyard, no one dared plough that ground again. In Iceland, old families sometimes still tell of the tilbury, a spirit conjured by a cunning woman to steal milk from neighbours. Though the church named it the devil's spawn, old-timers remembered it instead as a twisted fragment of the Viking belief that luck and plenty could be bound or stolen with the right words, buried runes, and silent bargains struck under frostbitten moons. In tiny villages along Norway's broken coast, fishermen nailed iron shears above stable doors, or tied small crosses of rowan wood with red yarn, not so much out of Christian piety, but because, deep down, they still feared that words carried by envy could sour a net's luck, or tangle a boat's sail in calm waters. The old curses even drifted into law. Records from the early modern period show church courts fining poor women for muttering threats over butter churns, or for tying knots in hair to bind a man's will. Some confessions read, like the saga's reborn curses, spoken in doorways, grave soil mixed with sheep's milk, a single rune scratched onto a barn beam by the light of a rush candle. These fragments shine with a simple truth. The fear that a word could warp the world never truly died. And what of the runes themselves? They linger, carved into boundary stones and half buried in bogs. Modern runologists trace each line, each curve, hoping to pull new meanings from these ghostly alphabets. Most find simple prayers or names. But some bind runes resist tidy translation, snarled clusters of lines that seem to echo old threats. May worms eat your heart. May your luck run backward. Whether these were curses or clumsy scribbles, no one can say with certainty. But the dread they inspire in the imagination is the same dread that hummed in the hearth-dark longhouses 1,000 winters ago. In recent years, archaeologists have uncovered wooden curse sticks in odd places, under abandoned farmhouses, beneath old church floors, evidence that the old magic survived beneath the new faith, the whispered poison hidden even under Christ's roof. It was never entirely banished, only pushed deeper into silence, waiting for the right shadow, the right rumour, the right desperate hand to reach for its promise once more. Perhaps the truest legacy of Viking curses is not the artifacts, but the hush that falls when their tales are told. In the far north today, a man might scoff at witches and grave dust by daylight, but come nightfall, alone in a creaking timber house with wind rattling the turf roof, he might pause at the thought of who once walked these valleys. He might wonder about the rune stone half sunk in the sheep pasture, the odd bundle found in the barn's oldest beam, the field that never yields a good harvest, though every seed is good and every prayer has been said. In these quiet spaces, the old curses breathe, not as thunderous roars of berserkers or the clang of iron in battle, but as whispers curling through cold soil, drifting through the cracks in old farmhouse doors, waiting for the wrong word spoken in anger, the right spite carried on envy's tongue. And so the legacy lives not only in the runes and sticks and grave relics kept behind museum glass, but in the soft dread that in this wide land of stone and snow, words still matter. That hidden anger can find its shape in a whisper, that the luck binding a family, a farm, a field can be turned as easily as a furrow of fresh soil. In the end, the Viking curse is not gone. It has only changed its mask, waiting in half-remembered rhymes, in moss-choked stones, in the hush that falls when someone says too softly, "Be careful, words have power here." When we speak of the Vikings today, we speak of iron swords, raised in raids, iron axes buried deep in shield wood, iron nails driven through the planks of dragon-proud ships that rode restless seas. But beneath that iron, something older whispers, something that cannot be forged or rusted away, the simple, terrible power of the spoken word. The Viking knew, as we still know deep down, that the world is not held together by iron alone. It is bound by trust, luck, promise, fragile threads spun in halls and farmsteads, where envy and fear slip through cracks in timber walls. They carved runes to hold these threads fast. They buried curse sticks to cut them loose. They whispered words that struck like blades but left no wound the eye could see. 1,000 winters have passed since the last seiðr-worker crouched by a burial mound, pressing grave dust into a lambskin pouch. Yet the shape of that fear lingers. It curls through old stories told by hearthfire, flickers in folk tales of boundary stones that must never be moved, fields that yield only ruin if their hidden binding is broken. We who stand in the glow of modern lamps and hum of machines imagine ourselves beyond such dread. We read of runes as quaint symbols, curses as relics of primitive minds. But do we not still fear a word spoken out of turn? The insult that clings like a burr to a name? The rumour that rots a reputation? We pretend we are iron, but the Vikings knew better, that a name is a thread, and a single tongue can fray it until the whole cloth unravels. In the deep fjords and wind-bent valleys, this truth hums like an old song. Old farmers still nail iron over doors, not only for luck, but for the hush it brings to restless dreams. In some villages, rowan crosses are tied with red thread, just in case. In winter markets, charm pouches hang for sale beside machine-made knives inside, a sliver of bone, a twist of hair, a nod to a dread that cannot be buried under asphalt roads and electric lights. Museums keep the relics behind glass, rune sticks carved from driftwood, staffs crowned with iron snakeheads, troll crosses bent from old nails. Scholars measure them, catalogue them, whisper learned words in lecture halls. Yet when they stand alone before these old things, they fall quiet. They feel what the Vikings felt, that the true edge was never in the iron blade, but in the tongue that wielded it in silence. Stories drift on. They say a house built over a grave mound will never be warm, no matter how bright the hearth burns. They say that envy, once spoken, walks on its own feet, that the land remembers every curse ever whispered into its soil, that it listens still, beneath furrows turned by tractors, beneath fences nailed by hands that do not know they hammer into old bones. And so the power lives. Not in the open, not in the boast and clash of shield walls, but in the hush that falls when a man curses under his breath, when a woman ties a knot of hair and mutters a name she dares not say aloud. It lives when someone stands alone in a dark field and feels the weight of words never spoken, but felt all the same. The Viking knew to curse was to shape the hidden world, to bind fate to malice, to bend luck with breath and bone. And though the runes lie buried, the burial mounds flattened, the grave sticks rotted to soil, the whisper lives on, as potent as any iron spear. Perhaps this is the truest legacy of the North, that we still fear what we cannot see, that we still believe, when all else fails, a word can break a man where no blade could reach, that the curse, the hidden blade carved in silence, is the edge we carry still, hidden under our tongues like an old flint knife, waiting for the right enemy, the right envy, the right betrayal. When next you stand among the standing stones, or walk a forest path where birch bark peels in ghostly scrolls, pause a moment. Listen for the wind sifting through pine needles. Watch how the shadows slip between old roots. Feel the hush that comes when you remember that the ground beneath your feet is never truly empty, that once, in a world not so far gone, people knelt here and spoke words sharp enough to strike the soul. And wonder, in that hush, if the world has really changed at all, or if, somewhere under the frost and moss, the old runes wait for a tongue brave or foolish enough to speak them awake.